Kaya, Wanju. Hi, welcome to the Yamaji Malpa Aboriginal Corporation Joint Forum. I would like to thank everyone returning for the second day and those who are just joining us for today. Again, on behalf of YMAC, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Country Needs People and the Pew Charitable Trust for kindly providing funding to support the delivery of this forum. My name is Bill Bennell. I'm a proud Noongar man and I'll be chairing and facilitating the event today. I would like to firstly acknowledge all of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples gathered here to participate in this online forum. We're all traditional custodians and the first carriers of our lands and country we are connected to. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of each country represented here today and extend that respect to others who are present. I'd like to now take a moment's silence in recognition of those that have passed and can't be present with us today. Thank you all. The aim of this forum is to facilitate peer-to-peer knowledge and exchange of traditional owners and other joint management experts to discuss what works, challenges, lessons learned, and possible future opportunities and directions for the sector. To provide attendees here for day 2 of this event, I'll give a short recap of day 1. Yesterday comprised of highly informative presentations and panel discussions focused on WA or West Australian experiences, with presenters joining us from all around the state. Starting off with presentations, we heard from Dr. Jose Culpers from YMAC and Dr. Bill Cruz from the Pew Charitable Trust, who provided some valuable background on joint management sectors in WA. This was followed by presentations from WA State Government, Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions, namely its Manager of Aboriginal Engagement, Planning and Lands Branch, Mr. Luke Bentley, along with his colleague Craig Olnick, who joined Jose and Bill for a short question Q&A session. Next up, we had some excellent presentations from various groups currently working on in the joint management space. These included Numba Baru Yaru Aboriginal Corporation from the Kimberley, Natamara Warren Aboriginal Corporation from the Pilbara, Talka Madu Paru Aboriginal Corporation, Man Jiljara and Yalpurl from the Western Desert, as well as Esperance Dalarak Native Aboriginal Corporation, no title Aboriginal Corporation from the South Coast. Each of these organisations gave early presentations and then shared their insights in an open session panel, and saw very considered and important questions come from the audience. A personal reflection from the presentation of mine is that joint management is an ongoing process of consultation and negotiation leading towards identified goals under that conservation and protection of natural and cultural heritage in accordance with the needs and aspirations of traditional owners. Joint management is not a structure, but is an aspect of community development largely determined by the needs of strengthening cultural identity, economic self-sufficiency, rather than just specific conservation management. There's no generic model or blueprint for successful joint management, and each agreement must be separately negotiated and must be responsive to the needs and aspirations of traditional owners. Overall, the feedback so far regarding yesterday's proceedings was very overwhelmingly positive, and I hope everyone here today gets as much of day 2 as we got out of day 1. Today we'll follow a similar format of day 1, but with examples from other parts of Australia, that is outside Western Australia, being shared. This will include presentations from Northern Territory, Queensland, Victoria, and Jervis Bay Territory. Before introducing the first presentation, I would like to go over some housekeeping related to the attendees navigating the forum's portals. To access some of the interactive features whilst in a session, click the tabs on the right of your screen. You will find the live Q&A section section. This is where you can ask a question. Click the live Q&A button, type your question and click submit. Please note that we may not be able to answer all questions, but we'll do our best. The discussion forum section is for you if you want to take part in discussions with fellow attendees. You are also able to write any session notes in the session notes tab that you're wanting to refer to later. These are your own personal notes and are not shared with the platform. Ensure you make time to visit the resource gallery where you will find various materials provided from some of our presenters. Also, check out the meeting hub to connect with other attendees, presenters and organisers. Simply click connect to request their contact details to contact later, or you can conduct a live chat through this function. Please note, when the session ends, you will need to click the back to timeline button at the top left of your screen. Please do not click the back arrow on your browser or you will log out of the portal. You will then be back to the agenda for the day and you can simply click join on the next session in the timeline to enter it. Finally, I'd like to just remind participants that each session today is recorded with the view to be able to share the following event out to, in particular, people who were interested but unable to attend. Okay, on to our first speaker. I'd like to introduce Dermot Smyth. The first presentation today will be from leading joint management expert, Dr. Dermot Smyth. Dermot has spent his career in Australia working on research, consultancy and education projects to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in land, sea and cultural and natural resource management. In particular, he is interested in encouraging collaboration between Indigenous people and Western science to address contemporary management issues on both land and sea country, identifying innovative ways to govern and manage and protect areas, and new pathways to co-manage the conservation estate, and supporting Indigenous rangers to protect cultural and natural values on country. I will now hand over to Dermot for his presentation. Thank you, Dermot.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Bill. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the countries represented in this forum. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge and thank all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I've worked with the last 40 years in the journey to regain the country. And it's their experience that has informed actions I want to share. Although, of course, the opinions I'm expressing are my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else. So, as Bill said, you'll be hearing from a number of presentations about on-ground experience of joint management around Australia. To do is to take a broader look at the joint management story over the last and particularly in the broader context of collaborative governance of protected areas, of which joint management is just one example. So it's important, of course, to acknowledge that the journey that we're on now began a long time ago, more than 60,000 years ago. And for that long period, there's been Indigenous ownership, governance and management of country around Australia. And it was about 100 years after the British invasion and colonisation of Australia that the first national park was established. And of course, that was done without Indigenous consent or engagement. That was the Royal National Park in south of Sydney, New South Wales. That was one of the first national parks anywhere in the world. And this national park, together with Yellowstone National Park in America, set the agenda for what national parks are for the next almost 100 years. And that is, they are established by governments through legislation over a bounded area of tenure to the exclusion of Indigenous peoples. And that's the model that we started with Australia. And the journey we've been taking on over the last 40 years is to rewrite that earlier colonial agenda to try and get a more just, a more reconciled way of area and state. From the 1970s, we started to have a consultation between Indigenous people and conservation management agencies of employment by agencies of Aboriginal people as rangers on national parks. The same model, the same idea of continued. That is, they were government entities. Governments maintained a monopoly on establishing protected areas and employing people to manage those protected areas. And then we come to the land rights era in Australia, where the beginnings of formal joint management started to occur, initially in the Northern Territory. That's Garriguernak Balu National Park, northeast of Darwin. But even then, with those initial moves towards joint management, the legacy of the old idea of national parks continued. That is, they were established, these joint management parks were established by government under legislation on a bounded tenure, not based on an Indigenous idea of country, but on a Western idea of a bounded tenure. And the rangers were also employed as government employees. Now that model has persisted, and it's been changed and adapted all over Australia. I think all states and territories now have some form of joint management arrangements. But many of those original characteristics of those early national parks continue. And I have to say, many of those characteristics, of course, have brought benefits to Aboriginal people: employment, training, interactions with visitors from all over the world, career opportunities, and so on. But as we'll see, they also have some challenges. Now, that essential approach to national parks, as I said, continued from the 1980s. But in 1994, what extraordinary happened that disrupted this of protected areas. That was in 1994, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, of which the Australian government and all state and territory governments in Australia are members. That organisation came up with the new definition of a protected area, which broke the monopoly of governments for declaring and managing areas. And a result of that new definition of protected areas, from 1998, we had the beginning of the dedication of Indigenous protected areas on Indigenous owned land in Australia, beginning in South Australia in 1998. And as many of you would know, we now have just over 80 Indigenous protected areas all over Australia. Now, there are some characteristics of these IPAs that are similar to national parks, and including similar to jointly managed parks, because they tend to involve collaboration with government agencies. And of course, there are rangers. But one big difference, of course, is that the rangers on IPAs are employed by traditional owner organisations themselves rather than government agencies. And I'll say a bit more about the comparison of these two approaches. But I think it's very important to grasp that from the late 1990s, we've been running a grand experiment in Australia of these two approaches to the collaboration of managing and governing protected areas in Australia. The joint management, where governments have invited Indigenous people to be part of their approach to management, and Indigenous protected areas, where traditional owners lead the process and often invite government to come and support them as they manage their. From 2011, the idea of Indigenous protection broadened out to be based on the idea of country rather than of Aboriginal owned land, Aboriginal tenure. And so we now have in many parts of Australia, Indigenous protected areas based on country, including multiple tenures, and as a result, including both land and sea country, managed and governed as one. So in the current era of joint management of national parks, what I'm seeing is the beginning of a convergence of these two approaches. They have run in parallel for quite a while, but not surprisingly, those traditional owners involved in joint management have been looking over their borders into IPAs to see how they're run and vice versa. And I think we're entering quite an exciting period where both approaches can learn from each other. And as the journey progresses, we'll see how that convergence continues. But one example of that convergence within jointly managed national parks, we can see in several of the long existing jointly managed parks, the emergence of independent traditional owner-led ranger groups within those jointly managed parks. So in those parks, you now have rangers employed by government agencies, but also independent traditional owner-led ranger groups, a bit like in IPAs. And likewise, to show how those two approaches are converging, in the multi-tenure IPAs, this one here in North Queensland, near where this is Maniyalpa Yidinji IPA. That's a tenure IPA that includes native title land, national park, forest reserve, environmental reserve, and marine park, all within. So the IPA provides a framework for putting country back together. And all those agencies responsible for those separate protected areas come together under the leadership of traditional owners to manage country as a whole unit. So that's part of the big story. And of course, we're not sure where this is heading, except we do know that this is an ongoing journey. It's, in my experience, it's quite usual, normal for particularly government people, but others as well, to regard whatever stage we're at as a final stage. We've now got there. So in the 1970s, people thought, oh, well, we're consulting traditional owners, we're employing a few people. How good is that? You know, we've arrived. And each subsequent stage was a similar sort of feeling. You know, we've got a board of management, we're employing some rangers, you know, that must be as good as it gets. But of course, like everything else, things change, new ideas come up. Individuals, particularly working across institutions, for example, traditional owners and policy makers in government, come together and come up with new ideas. And that's precisely how the Indigenous protected area idea developed in the 1990s and has evolved to this country-based multi-tenure idea. So we're hopefully heading to a stronger idea of Indigenous governance. And, you know, on a good day, I like to think we're heading back to with Indigenous governance country through protected areas. Just take a quick look at what this looks like on the ground. This is the top end of Australia, and you can see in red many Indigenous protected areas. The brown areas are national. Many of those are jointly managed. Also see in the coast here you can see some IPAs that include large areas of sea country here and also in Queensland. And these are interesting too in Queensland because these sea country IPAs, or the marine component of those sea country IPAs, lie within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So that's a way that traditional owners have led the joint management or collaborative management of their particular country within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And that process came from traditional owner initiatives. It did not come from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority inviting traditional owners to have a joint management arrangement over their country. So it's an example of how no matter what offer is on the table from government, and governments, in my view, have a right to decide what offers they want to put on the table, but whatever those offers are, traditional owners also have a right to say, right, we'll look at that offer, but we'll also look at what other options we've got. Another interesting part about this map here, if you look at the Torres Strait area, you'll see the red dots represent existing Indigenous protected areas in Torres Strait, including sea country IPAs, that's islands and sea country together, and the green dots represent new Indigenous protected areas that are currently under development, including land. But what you don't see in Torres Strait areas. It's very interesting that governments throughout the whole period of colonization and the modern era have restrained themselves from establishing either national parks or marine parks in Torres Strait, even though the Great Barrier Reef, itself extends well into Torres Strait. And when Torres Strait themselves in the last 10 or 15 years looked more closely at how to look after their land and sea country, they decided to establish Indigenous protected areas on their islands and sea country rather than invite governments to declare national parks and marine parks. And that's just a broader map of Australia, which many of you will be familiar with. It also gives quite a good indication that Indigenous protected areas now represent almost exactly 50% of the total protected area estate of Australia, at least on land. And in the Northern Territory in particular, sea country IPAs represent a larger area of marine protected area than marine protected areas. Pull this journey apart a bit more, I think it's very helpful to get a really forensic idea of what a protected area is, including a national park. And this comes down to the definition developed first in 1994 and then modified slightly in 2008 by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this definition has been adopted by all Australian governments and governments around the world. It's a clearly defined space, not just the flat area, but the space above as well. And these words are very important. A protected area is recognised, that is by government and by the society generally. It's dedicated by a competent authority, which could be government, it could be traditional owners, it could be private landholders, could be a conservation organisation. And of course, protected areas are managed. Once again, they can be managed by government, they can be managed by traditional owners, they can be managed in partnership. This is another important part. Protected areas are recognised, dedicated and managed through legal means or other effective means. And it was this broadening out to include other effective means that allowed Indigenous protected areas to be established 20 years ago and really broke the monopoly of government establishment of protected areas. And the purpose of all these protected areas all around the world are to achieve long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystems and cultural values. Now, if we look at how that definition is applied to national parks and indigenous protected areas, we'll get some idea about the differences and maybe about how they're converging as well. Parks are dedicated by government, so even the joint parks are dedicated. They're established through legislation, they're legislated, and they typically involve a single tenure, a bounded area of a Western idea. And they may include all or part of the country of a traditional owner, or the larger parks include multiple, can prove to be quite a challenge to govern those parks with an adequate, respectful voice of traditional owners involved in that country. Then national parks are managed according to the guidelines that are established internationally for the natural cultural values. Typically, there's a plan of management. Certainly for all the jointly managed parks, there's a plan of management, although we have many other parks in Australia where, unfortunately, we have no plan of management. Typically, the government will employ the rangers and other staff, and in jointly managed parks, of course, we know that will hopefully include traditional owners and other Indigenous peoples. And this is an important concept that in government national parks, the engagement is with traditional owners. Typically, a government agency will lead the engagement process, which is a fine thing to do. In my experience, the difficulty with that is that the most successful engagement, in my experience, comes when it is led by traditional owners. That is, when traditional owners engage with government to seek support for the momentum that traditional owners are developing to look after country. We have government-led management in national parks, even jointly managed parks, and all the eggs tend to be in a single basket. That is, everything like employment and economic development, conservation of is often heavily focused on this single relationship between traditional owners and the government conservation agency. There are exceptions. Now look quickly at IPAs. They are dedicated by traditional owners, not by government. They are established voluntarily, and I'll come back to that in a minute. They can be multiple or single tenures, and therefore incorporate the idea of country. They're also managed under the same guidelines. They protect and nurture cultural and natural values, with perhaps more emphasis on culture than a government national park, although both approaches are really obliged to look at cultural and natural values. All IPAs have a plan of management from day one, and it's traditional owner organisations, of course, that employ the rangers on Indigenous protected areas. And here we have engagement with government, traditional owner-led engagement with government and multiple other partners. It's a traditional owner-led process versus a government-led process. Just to get a clearer picture of what I'm talking about here with tenure-based protected areas versus country-based protected areas, this is a rather crude map showing underlying clan estates. And in red there is a small area of Aboriginal land, perhaps under Aboriginal land rights. And if you have a tenure-based system of protection, then your is limited to that small area. And next door we have a forest reserve and then marine park in the coast. In this particular example, all 4 areas would be managed by 4 separate agencies with no real mechanism to collaborate. If you have an Indigenous protected area based on country with multiple tenures, then you have this opportunity to country back together under the leadership of traditional owners with support from all those individual agencies managing those separate tenures. And this is the one that I mentioned in North Queensland. It's just across the Trinity Inlet from Cairns. If you've ever stood on the wharf in Cairns, you look across the water, you see this wonderful seascape and landscape. That is actually a very complicated tenure arrangement, but it is all one Indigenous protected area. The Manningalpa-Yidinji IPA includes native title land, national park, environment reserve, forest reserve, and marine park. Oops, these are supposed to be gone. This is the map of Queensland, again, just showing that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park stops here at the end of Cape York, even though the reef continues on up here. And it just emphasizes that governments have, for some reason, been constrained for establishing their government marine protected areas and national parks in Torres Strait. There is a board of management for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which includes a mandated Indigenous representative. And so there has been progress here over the last 30 years since the marine park was established, or more than 40 years now. To say that recognition of Indigenous interests in the governance of marine protected areas has fallen somewhat behind the progress that's been made in protected areas, although that is also changing. Okay, so some reflections on joint management. Look, the foundation for most of our joint management arrangements of national park is this idea of conditional Indigenous tenure. And that is, government is saying, look, traditional land back, and you want to own your land back, you want to be involved in management. For these particular areas, we think they're so important, we the government think they're so important that we'll only provide Indigenous tenure under the condition that there's a national park there. And that's the, governments have that power to do that. My feeling is that's a very difficult way to start a relationship, having this conditional beginning. And I think some of the challenges that joint management arrangements have faced over the years comes back to this fundamental conditional beginning. A similar related question is, who actually wanted this national park? Now, governments and traditional owners often begin with quite a common interest in wanting to look after country, wanting to look after biodiversity, wanting to nurture cultural values. It's just that they might have a different way of trying to achieve that. And because government has the power, in these cases of joint management, they're saying, well, the best way of achieving this goal of looking after country is through a national park. So that's what's going to happen. And we're inviting the traditional owner to join us in that process through arrangements. And as I said, lots of good things have happened and can happen and will happen through the management arrangements. But I still think it's a very challenging way to start a similar issue is whether you have a national park based on tenure or country. We've talked about that before. Separation of land and sea with the idea of a tenure-based national park. And a lot of this is all about how do you build trust in a long-term relationship. And some of those foundational issues, like conditional tenure, makes the building of trust quite difficult. And I think we should be now, having had this experience of 40 years of joint management, having experience of Indigenous protected areas, for future joint management arrangements, we should really be looking at how we can learn from that experience and build trust from the very beginning. Similarly, whether we can broaden out the partnerships instead of putting all the eggs in the conservation agency basket, which can often lead to tensions, particularly if the conservation agency is not all that well funded to do the job as well as they would like. As I said, what can we learn from the IPA story? And well, one of the things I think is the question of who leads the process. And my experience of Indigenous government partnerships has been that the most productive, effective partnerships have occurred are free to lead them. And the role of government is then to come behind and support the vision and the momentum that traditional owners have. So what would we say is best practice given all of that story I've been telling? Well, one of the things I would say the best way to start is for government and perhaps other partners to support traditional owners to develop a plan and a vision for country so that they can look at all the values, all the potential partners, and all the options they have for managing their country, including their economic future, into the future. So they would provide an opportunity to explore, do they want a national park? Do they want an IPA? Do they want something else? Rather than be only presented with this one option, sort of take it or leave it or try and negotiate the best outcome. So I'm getting close to the end, you'd be glad to hear. I just try and summarize some of what I see as the trends in collaborative governance of protected areas, of which joint management is just one example. So the trend is over those 40 years, and not just in Australia, but internationally, the trend is from coercion and government-led engagement to the provision of government support for traditional owner and Indigenous initiatives and momentum. The trend from government leadership to traditional owner leadership, from tenure-based to country-based, from single partners to multiple partners, from a focus on biodiversity only to a broader focus on socio-economic development. Of land, national park and marine parks in the sea, to holistic land and sea country IPAs or other holistic protected areas. This is a particular, I think, in the era of sea level rise, where we've got our marine parks gradually invading the coastal national parks. The other trend is from only a narrow basket of government funding to a diversity of funding, include multiple government sources, but other partners like philanthropic organizations, commercial enterprises, tourism, and so on, and also fee-for-service work. The other trend, as we've said before, is the trend from rangers employed by government agencies only to rangers also employed by traditional owner organizations. And this doesn't have to be one or the other. It's a question of providing a diversity of opportunities and providing what works well for traditional owners in particular places. So the opportunities I see for the future is to learn from the 40 years of challenges and successes of joint management, for government to support planning, governance, and management, and for all parties to continue to innovate and adapt as the joint management journey continues. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention today.
People will get an opportunity to ask questions in a Q&A session a little bit later after the next session. Just want to remind everyone that the next session, you will actually need to leave this session, which you go back through your timeline, and then open the examples of joint management across Australia presentations that we're about to do. Also, I noticed there was a bit of discussion in the discussion forum about the lagging. Please note also that Dermot's PowerPoint presentation will be part of handouts as well if you want to read through that. We apologise for some of that video lagging, but sometimes that's out of our control as well. But also, just to let people know, so our next session will be opening in close to 5 minutes. So please ensure that when you leave this area, go back through your timeline, you'll go into the agenda and you can actually access the next session that will be coming up in 5 minutes. If you do have any questions for Dermot, please jot them down now. And you can ask them after the session from the wider joint management session we're going to have across from all of Australia. So please jot down any questions you have for Dermot, ready for the next session at the end of the next session, and when we have our Q&A panel. 2 ways you can do that. one, just click on live Q&A, type in your question, away you go. Or you can, put your hand up and ask a live question, and we'll pull you in from the camera, and you'll be able to ask a live question as well. So there's two means you can ask questions, one written, one live. So just keep that in mind, and we'll see you in the next session. Thank you all. Thanks, Dermot.